Hi, everyone. Welcome to the National Research Collaborative for Foster Alumni in Higher Education's webinar series. My name is Amy Salazar, and I'm an assistant professor at Washington State University, Vancouver. Today, our presenters will be Dr. Denicia Carlay from the Alameda County Social Services Agency and Dr. Lauren Ford from the San Mateo Community College District. And their presentation will be entitled Humanizing and Healing-Centered Practices to Support Foster Care Alumni in Higher Education. And now we will join into that webinar, which is already in progress.
Go ahead and open up with the recording being in progress with a land acknowledgement. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm located in Alameda County, which is in Oakland, California, but I'm currently in Georgia, which is occupied Muskogee and Creek land. Just want to orient you to the space and to the land. And so I want to invite you all to ground yourselves with me. So I'm going to read through about a 2-minute mindfulness activity. And it's great that you have your screens off, because that way you don't have to worry about who's looking at you with your eyes closed and all those things. And so I'm going to first teach you a breathing technique in order to ground you in this moment. So with this breathing technique, you're going to have an inhale of 4 and an exhale of 8. There's a lot of science behind if we have a longer exhale, it really allows us to tap into our parasympathetic nervous system to relax our minds and our bodies so we can be present and attuned to what's in front of us. So I want to invite us all to have 3 collective breaths with that, and then I'm going to walk us through the land acknowledgement. So an inhale for 4, 2, 3, 4, and an exhale for 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Inhale for 4. And an exhale for 8. Slowly letting it out. Inhale for 4. And an exhale for 8. With this exhale, I want you to feel your shoulders sinking in, keeping your eyes closed or your gaze down, and just listen to my voice. I want you to take a moment to envision the land. This can be the land right outside of your door, or your favorite body of land to visit, any type of land. What does it look like? What shapes do you notice in the land? Are there any particular smells or sounds as you envision yourself there? What energy do you feel all around you? Now take a moment to imagine the native people who tended to that land that you're on for over 20,000 years, the ways in which they were on the land and one with the land, and how the land still holds their stories within it. Notice what images come to mind and sit with those images for just one moment while you also notice your body sensations. Now take a deep breath in, slowly release it out. And as you exhale, take a moment to express gratitude to the land for its provision and to the indigenous people for tending to the land. Take a deep breath in. On this exhale out, I also want you to give thanks for all the contributions that your own people have made to the land. And now with your last breath, a deep inhale in, exhale out. I invite you to open your eyes, come back to the space as you're ready. If we think of territorial acknowledgements as sites of potential disruption, they can be transformative. They can be transformative acts that to some extent undo indigenous erasure. I believe this is true as long as these acknowledgements discomfit both those speaking and hearing the words. The fact of Indigenous presence should force non-Indigenous peoples to confront their own place on this land. And that's an offering of wisdom from Chelsea Val, who is of the Métis tribe. In the interest of time, we're going to go on into our presentation, but I do want to invite you to drop into the chat one word or one phrase for how you're feeling in this moment.
Thank you for guiding us through that mindfulness exercise and also the land acknowledgement, especially this week of all weeks as we started the week with Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I appreciate that intentionality, Denicia, and how we are kind of jumping into this conversation around healing-centered practices and how we're able to support our students that we're here to serve. So thank you so much for that time. I'm going to go next to our kind of community agreements. We really want to engage with you all during this workshop and this activity, or there's a set of activities that we're going to jump into. We're also going to ask questions and what have you throughout the presentation. And so we'll feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself when it's time. I'm loving the engagement thus far in the chat, and so we appreciate your participation. The community agreements that we kind of came up with in order to really provide a space for engagement are up on the screen, and so I'll slowly kind of go through them, and then we'll jump right into kind of the work that we're focusing on today. But we invite everyone to be here with open mind, open ears, and an open heart for us to be able to remember to take space and also make space for others, to remain present and engaged. And that mindfulness exercise is a really great way to kind of start that ability to be present as we kind of quiet all of the noise and things around us and are able to just be here with one another. To acknowledge the difference between intent and impact. We're all learners and we're all kind of on this journey together. And so there's no kind of perfect way to be in this space. We're all here along the way, which is another reminder to give grace both to yourself and to others, both today, tomorrow, within the work that we do. Leading with grace is a really wonderful way to be able to remember, again, that we're all kind of learning and we're doing our best within this work. And this one I really love. Listen from the inside out. Pay attention to when your body is in discomfort. It could be telling you a number of different things, right? And so whether you are feeling blessed or full, engaged, grateful, ready, connected, relaxed, or feeling a little bit uncomfortable and curious, that feeling of your stomach feeling uneasy or your shoulders feeling relaxed is all signals to our brains about what it is that we're learning, how we're growing in those spaces of discomfort. And then finally, bring as much of your full self to this space as you can. Don't worry about using the correct terms or being perfect. We just want you to be here with us today because you is who we need in this space. Not a different version of you, just you. And so this is, some ideas about how we can thoughtfully engage and exist in this time that we have together. And we're really excited to continue to engage with you all for the next, however many minutes we have. So we'll start kind of this presentation really with an opening activity as a way to explore your values. And so this is this engagement piece that we were talking about before. Over in the corner of the screen, you'll see this little icon. There's a microphone and a little chat box. That's kind of a signal that we'd like for you to engage with us. And so whether it's taking your mic off of mute or typing in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you when you see that kind of signal on the screen. And so for the activity that we're going to engage with now, we'd love it if you had a piece of paper. It could be a scrap paper, if you have a notebook next to you, whatever. We'd love for you to write down some information. We'd like for this to be a tactile exercise. If you're not able to write anything down, that's okay. You can use, your mobile device or what have you and chat it, but we're going to ask you to be making a list. Okay. Okay. So within this list, the instructions are on the screen, but we'd like for you to write down 10 things in your life that are important to you in the form of values. And so this could be a number of different things. Family, travel, open land,
Shopping.
all types of things, shopping, money, shoes, whatever works for you. So we'll give you around 30 seconds or so to write down your 10 things on your list. We'd love to see at least 7 if you can't get all 10.
I was gonna play some theme music, but all I can think of is old school Doug, like do 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 do.
I think had this been a younger time in life, Doug might have been on my top 10 values list. That Nickelodeon lineup was so good.
Yes, yes, it was.
Okay, we have about 10 more seconds, and then we're going to go into the next step. All right, so if you have your list in front of you, the next part of this exercise is you have 30 seconds to pick 3 items from the list that represent the least important values, and we would like for you to cross them out. This is where that tactile piece comes in. Cross out 3 items on your list. All right, you have about 5 more seconds. Okay, so in the next piece, you have 20 seconds to cross out 2 more values. All right, about 5 more seconds. All right, the final instruction, you have 20 seconds to cross out 2 more values.
This is so interesting doing this in a Zoom space, because when we
I
do this in
know.
person, you got people begging us like, no, not anymore.
Okay. All right. So hopefully you've been able to cross out some things on your list. As Denicia said, being in a Zoom space, we are absolutely going by the trust method. We believe that everything is happening, which is great. And now we'd like to just hear from you a little bit about what this process was like for you. What was it like to be asked about your values and then turn around and be asked to cross them out? So feel free to come off of mute or drop in the chat some thoughts about that experience.
I think they're too traumatized, Lauren.
Maybe. It's hard. It's sad and it's hard to choose. Absolutely. Thank you.
I can share. I was thinking that it was kind of like a prioritizing exercise. And I was like, okay, this is good. I'm narrowing it down and I can like really see what matters the most, but then I had to cross all of them off. So I didn't have enough to last the whole time. So I was like, wow, okay, I'm left with nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's hard. That's hard. And some people wrote in the chat It was hard to prioritize. Some felt as though they ended up with the first three that they put down. I really appreciate another ad here. It's like asking someone to forget a part of themselves. I felt like there was no fun or anything that gave back to just me within the list of items. And they're all important, right? We asked you to write down what your values were. So sure, they're all important. And so I can see that that's hard. Wanted to add some extra things so that weren't very important so you could cross them off more easily and feel less costly. That's super true. It's difficult to put the values in words so quickly, and it is hard to eliminate them. So with that in mind, just kind of as practitioners, researchers, educators, social workers, right, within this work that we do, the question about, being able or being asked to identify your values and then cross them out, we feel as though it does directly relate to our students' experiences, especially within education. Historically, in these educational spaces, we've asked for students to either adjust or discard their values in order to make it through our system, right? Such an ask adds to the disconnect within the student's experience within their education, where they can't be themselves, or they aren't welcomed, or they don't see themselves and they feel othered. And quite frankly, it can be dehumanizing. So our focus today is really about how we can humanize the foster care alumni experience in higher education through healing-centered practices, which we'll get to in a moment. So we appreciate you all going through this exercise with us, even if it was, writing down things on paper and crossing it out, and being able to kind of, tangibly see sometimes the way in which that shows up within our work. So the things that we're going to talk about really quickly, we have a transformative framework called the T3 framework that really focuses on the historical overview and the intersections of social work, psychology, critical theory, and education. And we'll go through that kind of quickly. And then we'll go into talking a little bit more about healing-centered engagement, really thinking about that shift from trauma-informed practices towards healing-centered engagements. And then if we have some time, we'll be able to do a critical reflection. If we don't have the time today, then we'll send it to you all in the slide deck, okay? So an organization that both Denicia and I have worked for called the Equity Institute developed this T3 framework, which there are different tiers to the ways in which we engage with students, specifically in education, but can be applied to other sectors as well. And so each of these different pieces of the T3 framework represents really that growth in order to get to transformative education or transformative practices. And so there's the traditional, which we consider like T1, right? Your kind of basic first tier area. And within traditional, the traditional ways that we've typically gone about our work really is what's yielding a lot of the inequities that we're currently seeing within our institutions. And this is where a lot of the reform efforts that are coming out now is really kind of grounded in, is this traditional framework. It's often very Eurocentric. It's established through deficit thinking, and it doesn't consider race, bias, and socio-historical factors that have really created the spaces and environments that we and our students find themselves in. And really the biggest piece is it privileges really rules without regard to what students need, right? So it's very much just kind of, this is policy, here are the rules, this is the way that we're doing things. But it doesn't have this kind of greater grasp and scope onto how we can actually meet students' needs. T2 is considered transitional. And within the transitional framework, it addresses inequities through the adoption of different strategies and tools. And those are really designed to fix the student rather than being able to look at an entire system and think critically about the way in which the system is working towards oppression, and really being able to have an individualized thinking around the impact of equity. So these are often very kind of tool-based approaches to just like fix the student but not necessarily fix the system or the space in which they find themselves. And then finally, we have transformative. And transformative work within this regard is really grounded in innovative anti-racist and anti-sexist consciousness. It acknowledges the historical, social, political causes of inequity. It interrogates systems, policies, and tools that have really been established to maintain the status quo, rather than just saying like, oh, yes, this is a policy that exists, and there's nothing that we can do about it. It takes a step back and it thinks about what we can do within our sphere of influence, and how we can make really intentional change in order to right-size inequities that exist within our areas. Finally, it invites the way forward focused on the holistic healing of students and their communities. Students have agency to develop their lens and to understand the challenges and experiences within these broader social political contexts. When they're engaged and empowered, they're excited to learn. And this results in an overall success of the students, right? It views students' backgrounds, cultures, and lived experiences as assets to their learning. And this includes the transition away from narrowing in on the reasons why they were in care in the first place to uplifting the opportunity needed to support their healing within our spaces. And this includes both in practice from educational support program practitioners to social workers to researchers, and the ways in which we describe and discuss students within our studies. As a moment of reflection, as I was writing my dissertation, it was really hard to find research that wasn't written with a deficit lens or perspective of the participants. It's not to say that we are to just erase the students' experiences if they're quote unquote bad, right? But rather, how do we talk about these experiences from an asset-based framework? Because language is so powerful. If foster care alumni are currently being referred to as, for lack of better wording, but these poor kids who have been through these terrible things and everything is against them, and the only way that they'll ever make it out is if they're either resilient enough or they get rescued by a special program, because only 2% ever graduate from college. And if they don't do X, Y, Z, then they won't make it, right? And not to say that there's not truth into that, but how do we really kind of frame those conversations in a way that is focused on strength? Because messages such as those can be internalized by our students, and it can be really difficult to fight through. And it's even harder when the people who are supposed to provide the support also have that internalized message about who you are. And then they either show up as being despondent because they doubt that their efforts will matter anyway, or as saviors who have an overwhelming amount of support, which can be great, but can also remove the students' access to agency. And then there are low expectations, which doesn't actually push or encourage the student to move forward. And so I think really within our conversation today, we're focusing on how do we reframe that narrative, both within our practice, with the way in which we show up and the way in which we think about how we support our students. And so before we really jump into it, I just want to share this one quote from Sean Ginwright, and we're going to kind of go into his work in a moment. But he was working with a group of young people, and this is a quote from one of his recent articles. It says, "During one of our sessions, I explained the impact of stress and trauma on brain development and how trauma can influence emotional health. As I was explaining, one of the young men in the group named Marcus abruptly stopped me and said, 'I am more than what happened to me. I am not just my trauma.' I was puzzled at first, but it didn't take me long to really contemplate what he was saying." So again, our focus today is really on how do we invite humanizing practices within our work, right? Because our students are more than just their trauma. They're more than just something bad that may have happened to them. They're full human people, right? And so we want to uplift that and acknowledge that. And so I'm going to turn it over to Denicia to talk a little bit about trauma-informed practices in healing-centered engagements and how that shows up in the work that we do.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. So yes, so Sean Ginwright, we're going to go deeper and spend the bulk of this time talking about healing-centered engagement. But in order for us to do that, we always have to pay homage to the foundations that gave way for that. So I'm going to first start in centralizing us around trauma-informed. I feel like this has become really pervasive in the field. And so a lot of us are already familiar of what it means to be trauma-informed. But just in case, want to lay the groundwork. So this is a model that was, not right now, sweetie. Close the door. Sorry, my son. Thank you. This was a model that was developed a while back, but Dr. Dorado from UCSF expanded this model a little bit more deeply for us to see it through an ecological systems perspective. So where you have our students at the center, right, who are receiving the resources, the support that are being exposed to the environment. And then you have staff, so school-based staff, and you also have the family, caregivers, community members, and then you have the system itself and the leadership. And it's super important that when we look at anything that we're infusing, whether it's trauma-informed, healing-centered, T3 frameworks, that we're looking at the impact that it has on all those different ecological levels, because all of those levels impact the students and the folks that we're trying to serve. So with trauma-informed, the premise of it is understanding trauma and stress. So being aware that there are things that happen to us in our environment that cause distress, that make it challenging to navigate through the day-to-day things of life. That model has since been expanded. As you can see, there's other bubbles around here for us to be more culturally humble and more equity focused, to really bring in social emotional learning. So for those of us who have been trained through K through 12, you start to see all that PBIS, positive behavioral intervention support strategies that are being rolled out, like around bullying prevention and wellness practices. You have empowerment and collaboration. So you see a lot more folks at different levels working together and really premising this in compassion and dependability and making sure that there's safety and predictability in the young people's environment in order for this to flourish. This is a beautiful model, but as Dr. Ford so eloquently talked about, it is rooted more in the deficit-based narrative of that because something happened to you, we now have to come in and fix something. So Dr. Sean Ginwright has expanded that work into healing-centered and great engagement. So on the next slide, we'll kind of see that comparison between trauma-informed and healing-centered to help us learn about what else is true. As that gentleman that Sean was working with pointed out so well, that I'm more than just the worst thing that's ever happened to me. So with trauma-informed, we have that main question is, what happened to you? Right? So for you to show up in my classroom with certain behaviors, something had to happen to you. Or we're looking at them, as Dr. Ford pointed out, through that, like, how can I save you? Like something's wrong and I'm here to, focus on that harm. It's more of a clinical and individualized approach by looking at, Denicia as someone who has lived experience in the system, that how I'm presenting in the classroom, that I'm the only one being impacted, and therefore I'm the person that needs the attention. And it focuses on treatment of the client. Healing-centered engagement is asking, what's right with you? What else is true, right? Because as Dr. Ford articulated, the students that we're working with are whole people, right? So it focuses more on a holistic healing approach that doesn't just focus on the individual, but also the interpersonal relationship, also the institution, and brings in so much more of the socio-political context, because you're really considering the environmental context of the trauma. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that in the next slide. And it also supports providers. And that's what I really love about this model. So many of our other models are focused on like, this is an intervention that we're going to deliver to this student. But with healing-centered engagement, it's predicated on the premise that as educators, as social workers, as researchers, we must first be willing to take the medicine ourselves and do the work on ourselves and heal from the things that have caused different social toxins to show up in our body if we're going to be able to be effective in working with students. So with this next model, it goes deeper into what are some of those experiences and how do they show up in our bodies, right? And so ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is another term that's been around for over 20 some odd years. So this started in the 1995, predicated on the Kaiser Permanente experiment, and really looking at like those that are dying early they're having certain like diseases and ailments in their bodies, there's something that's happening that is causing the diseases to show up more often for them. So he did a study that included thousands of people and learned that there are certain adverse experiences that happen during childhood that then give way for social, emotional, cognitive impairments that lead to health risk, that lead to diseases, that lead to early death. So what those who have done deeper research into this over the last 10 years, such as the RISE Institute, we have, which is based out of Richmond, California, we have this expanded ACEs model where we're taking more of the intergenerational, historical trauma, racial and political and local context, all of these things that are already happening in our environment, in our DNA, before we even get to the layer of childhood, where certain complex traumas might start. I also appreciate this model because it talks about that allostatic load, which is the wear and tear on the body. So it starts to talk about like how these things start to impact us, even if we're not realizing it, because we're just operating through our survival. And we develop certain coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms in order to combat that, which then leads to the diseases that you see in communities that then leads to early death. And so I bring up this model because it lays the foundation for healing-centered engagement. So on the next slide, it talks more about how healing-centered engagement is more political than it is clinical. It really starts to go deeper into what are the elements that we have control over that are showing up in our environment that are causing market distress in our bodies, in our communities, and ourselves. And as I said before, it's also very culturally grounded and is all about healing and restoring identity. And so looking at like, what are the race-based elements? What are the gender-based elements, the sexual orientation-based elements that are contributing towards some of the things that we're seeing inside of ourselves? And it's focused on being very strengths-based and asset-driven. So we're really looking at harnessing the areas of well-being that we want rather than suppressing the symptoms that we don't want, right? And it really supports, like I said before, not only the healing of the young people, but also the adult providers. So in a nutshell, HCE is a strengths-based process that transforms individual practices. It advances healthy interpersonal, so the relationship that we have with one another, connections, and improves institutional culture in order to create healthy outcomes for youth and adults who serve them. In order for us to be able to fully understand healing-centered engagement, we must first understand the social toxins that show up in the environment. So on the next slide, we have a graphic to show you that really goes deeper into this concept of social toxicity. And this is a term that was coined by Dr. James Gabarino around the ecosystems of harm. And so his research really shows us that we have all of these, we're so used to environmental toxins, right? Like we went through a whole phase where there was asbestos paint in the walls and homes. And so we had to tear down those walls because we're realizing that those asbestos, when we were breathing it in, was causing, market distress in our lungs, and we're showing up bodily diseases. So when it comes to like toxins that are in the environment, pollutants, we're like, yeah, we can see, like, we can look those under a microscope and see how those are causing distress. But what we don't often talk about is the social toxins. And so those are the isms that we're all living and breathing and swimming in around colonization. So you have poverty, you have colorism, homophobia, patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, all of those different isms that are rooted in hatred. And so what's happening is, as an individual person with my intersecting identities, I am having to navigate the world based upon the isms that are around me that are impacting me. And then I come and I bring those into my household. And then I interact with my son, and I, might close boundaries around him to protect him from those isms that I know that could cause him harm as a little Black boy. And then he has to go to school. And then his institution, his school that he is in, is also saturating those isms and are interacting with him. And the cycle repeats itself. So healing-centered engagement goes deeper than just being aware that those isms and those social toxins exist, but it goes deeper into now, how can we heal from them as a collective? Because when we're harmed, as a collective, we also need to heal in collective as well. Next slide, please. So with healing-centered engagement, trying to also check time because they're coming up on it. I'm going to give you like a super quick overview to go a little bit deeper into the mindset shifts, which are called the pivots that you have to have in order to adopt the CARMA principles. At the end of our presentation, I'll also drop a link because Dr. Sean Jenwright and his team at Flourish Agenda, this is one of their shirts, Together We Flourish, still a part of that community. They have a whole healing-centered engagement certification. That's like a 20-hour online interactive thing that you can sign up for if you really want to walk through these in deeper content. But in the interest of 5-minute time, I'm going to go ahead and just give you guys a nugget. So Dr. Sean Jenwright talks about how just how we, with the land acknowledgement, how to first ground ourselves. I could have just said, let's be aware that we're on native land, people. And then you guys could be like, yes, we're aware. And then you go on to the next thing. But by having the time to really slow it down, ground yourself, tap into your senses, be present, it allowed you to go deeper into the awareness. So his pivots are mindsets, practices that you have to adopt in order to really step into healing-centered engagement with students. So the first one that he talks about is bringing awareness of how we are all walking through life with certain lenses, right? Those lenses are filtered by our cultural identities. As I said, as a Black woman, there are certain experiences that I've had in life that then shape the way that I see the world because how the world has seen me. And so what he talks about is that there's nothing wrong with us having different lenses. That's something that we all have. But what we need to do a better job of is holding the mirror up to ourselves to really look at how those lenses are impacting us. Because we might not do that. We might not look at like, well, wow, like because the world has been interacting with me a certain way, I show up a certain way. And how does that impact the way that I parent? How does that impact the way that I teach? How does that impact the way that I'm a researcher? So he talks a lot about holding that mirror up to be mindful of the lenses that you bring into this world. The next thing that he talks about is relationships. Transactional relationships are that tit for tat. Do this, do that, give me this. I'm evaluating your essay. Here's your points for that. Some of those, there's transactions that have to occur in every relationship, but he pushes you further to engage in that T3 framework around engaging in transformational relationships. How well are we really getting to know our students and ourselves? How well are we leaning into opportunities to be vulnerable and courageous, to allow our experiences to be provided as learning opportunities in the classroom? So it's really like, how are you tapping in and touching in with someone in a more deeper way in order for true transformation to occur? Movement, this is my favorite, of being able to slow things down and moving from a hustle culture to one of flow. And that is super hard, right? Like we are in capitalist America where everything is go, 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 productivity, productivity, paper, paper, paper. I'm adding 5 more students to your class roster because we can, all these different things. And so being mindful of how you can embrace certain intentional practices in your classroom spaces and your personal spaces to slow down, because if we don't slow down and reflect, we're going to continue to like be in frenzy, and we're not going to know what's actually working and what isn't working. So when we're able to be in more flow, it gives us more opportunity to be more reflective and take stock, to engage in those transformational relationships, to have that mirror work. And the last one is shifting from a mindset of problem solving to possibility thinking. And this one's really hard for people to do. We are so good as problem solvers, y'all, as educators, social workers, researchers. That's what we went to school for, to solve your problem. But he talks about when we're focused, what we bring our attention to, that's what we elevate. So if we're focused on solving a problem, we're going to focus on there being a problem, right? But when we're able to shift into more of a possibility thinking, that allows us to expand our thought process into what else is true. What are the rich things that you're bringing into my classroom? What are the elements of your cultural practices that I can learn from as an educator? So I'll leave it at that. And briefly, I'm not going to go slide by slide, but I will express that there are 5 different principles for healing-centered engagement. And so we're going to click really quickly through those, Lauren.
Dr. Carlay, can I just say, like,
Oh, yeah.
you just mentioning, so when I put it in the chat, like the pivots piece is incredibly important, but it's hard, right? To rethink the way in which we've been trained for stuff. But the point about problem solving, if we look for problems then to solve, then that's all we see. Like, mind blown, right? Because it really does takes that intentional shift to say, instead of like, let me focus on all the things that are wrong, like, let me focus on what the possibilities are. And it's different, right? It's different from kind of the training that we've had, the ways in which we've approached our work, but it's incredibly important. So if y'all don't get nothing else from this presentation today, this slide right here has all the juice, all the veggies, all the goodest pieces, because it really is focusing on the, what is kind of the traditional way that we do things, and then how can I intentionally make that shift? So a great visual representation for our visual learners out there like myself.
Ashe. And Ashe just means, and so it is. So I'm going to talk real quick just about this slide, and then we're going to skip past some slides because we just kind of break down this slide a little bit more. But you will all have access to this slide deck. So these are the 5 principles of healing-centered engagement, just like we went over the different tenets of the T3 framework. So within healing-centered engagement, there's the belief that we are all harmed within our identities, right? And so we all have those different intersecting identities. And it's hard because I don't know how much we're coming in with knowledge, but basically there are different parts of me. Like, I'm not just what you see. There are more parts of me than just as a Black woman. There are parts that you don't see that are related to my religion, that are related to my socioeconomic class, that are related to the fact that I have lived experience as a former foster youth. Those are parts that you don't see. So those are all a part of my cultural identity. And so with healing-centered engagement, it's about being aware of those cultural elements and being able to bring them into the classroom so that way I can learn and engage with you through those different parts of me as I feel comfortable. Agency, Dr. Ford already talked a lot about. It's really about where I believe that I have room to be able to navigate and perform and show up and contribute, right, to what is happening. And so the more that we're able to expand the amount of agency that our students have, the more comfortable that they will feel in being able to navigate things with us. Those relationships, we've talked so much about how they need to be transformative. And that's not, so often we can think like, oh, they're going to be transformative if I learn the student's name, or if I bring sweets, candies and stuff to my class all the time. You have to be able to let the students like pay attention and let them tell you what they need from you in order for the relationship to be transformative. Meaning, we all have different ways that we make, that we have like, how do I phrase this? We all have different ways that we make sense of what is happening around us. So we can all be in the classroom setting. You can deliver, a lecture or what have you, and step out and be like, whew, that was the best lecture I've ever given. And then you can have students in the classroom who are like, I have no idea what she was talking about, right? And so really being able to take stock around how different meetings and interpretations happen. And then what is the purpose? What is the purpose that your students are coming in with? What is the purpose of the content that you're delivering? Why you're choosing something over another thing? And the last one is aspirations. So much of our work is rooted, like I said, in like the here and now, but in order to really get folks from one level to the next, you have to have an anchor to their dreams. You have to be willing to engage in the hope development in order for aspirational thinking to occur in the classroom. So we're going to skip over the next couple of slides, and I'm going to end my portion of the dialogue. Yes, because it's 11:50. And this is the research that I did for my dissertation. So a little bit of background about me, as I said, personal history, and then I became a social worker after going through all the school stuff that you need to go through to do that. And I worked in the child welfare field for over 10 years. Then I became an educator, and I taught about foster youth at the higher education level for a couple of years. And then now I'm doing nonprofit and child welfare work again. And so in that, I've worked with hundreds of foster youth, and my dissertation research is a capitulation of their stories, but also really focused on 12 that share directly. And so this is the research around how the social toxins that they experience as it relates to the different CARMA principles that we've already talked about, where there is so much brokenness in their identity development, as you can imagine, from having to be so transient within the foster care system, but also when you're taken from your families of origin and what gets lost in translation there. So I won't go through all of these because I'll let you all, read through them, but really wanted to offer up that for me, and I believe that this is true for everyone, that in order for you to learn and grow, you have to do that in collaboration with someone who is an expert in their experience. And so I situated my entire dissertation in what I could learn from the young people who are in the foster care system. And so anything that I have right here is what their recommendations are to us as educators, social workers, and researchers about how to have a healing-centered engagement approach with them. And so honoring their diverse lived experiences. So recognizing it as an asset and not as a detriment. Recognizing that they have so much navigational capital because they have had to. And so that is a superhero strength that they've had to build up. Acknowledging that you have to have authentic care in order to cultivate relationships. We have another slide that you'll see in our slide deck that really situates just on the work on Dr. J. Luke Wood about how you have to have a high level of support, high level expectations, and also authentic care in order to do your best work with students. Allowing them to express how they have made sense of their experience, because that allows them to take empowerment of that. And then also what I talked about before about restoring hope when it comes to aspiration building. So I know that is 11:53 and I don't think we have time for the activity. Nope.
No, but I do think that this is a great point of pause. Just in the slide deck, there's also some kind of a reflection activity with the student profile and things like that to kind of tap into. But in lieu of kind of the student profile piece, we are curious just about maybe some takeaways or questions that you might have just based on the kind of different points that we've discussed today. And so thinking about within your own practice, within your own work, do you see any opportunities for a shift with kind of how you currently might approach the work that you do? Any key things that you want to continue to think about or ponder kind of moving forward? We'd love to really hear from you and see how this impacts your day-to-day. Yes, and you're more than welcome to come off of mute or, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you, Lauren and Denicia. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of reiterate that questions, you can send those to me, to the group, or you can just feel free to take yourself off mute to do that.
I have a question. This is Kim Eckhart. So I know the focus of your talk today is on higher ed, and I am an adjunct professor at Columbus State, but I also work for a nonprofit, Children's Defense Fund. And I'm just wondering, if you could talk about, why did you decide to kind of really focus in on, the context of higher ed? And is there something specific about that context that lends itself to these kinds of practices? And can you apply this in other contexts?
I can speak to the second part of your question, and then maybe Dr. Ford can speak to the first part, but this can be applied in any context. So
you're on mute, Denicia.
Thank you.
No problem.
Just drop the link in the chat for the Healing Centered Engagement certification, but just as a heads up, or FYI rather, Dr. Sean Ginwright's work was rooted in working with teenage young people. So there's been 30 years of his research that's just been focused on Black youth and inner city youth. And by youth, meaning ages 12 to roughly 18. And so Flourish Agenda, which is the nonprofit that he oversees, does work with K through 12 schools, does work with community-based organization, does work with Black and Brown families directly, does community organizing. I believe that we focused on higher ed in this presentation more so because of the demographic that my understanding was who was going to be in the room. But to answer your question, the information and the knowledge that we've shared is applicable in any sector.
I concur. There's there's also a question in the chat. Does one need to be versed in trauma-informed care before moving into HCE, or can HCE be a starting point?
HCE can absolutely be a starting point. It's a standalone. Personally, I think it's helpful just to understand the trauma-informed lens, but HCE doesn't see itself as attached to trauma-informed at all. So yes, you can absolutely start at HCE.
Are there any other questions?
I got another question directly, which is, what do you think having a healing-centered approach might look like when you're helping a youth work toward going to college?
I think that oftentimes a lot of our college access related programs and the curriculum that is within it, so whether it's the workshops and what have you, is really focused on like task completion, and also to some extent, again, like fixing the student, for lack of better terms. It's just like, here's information that you need to know that you haven't had already in order to, you know, hopefully get into school. I think that being able to really take a step back and do those pivots to engage in a deeper sense, to really unpacking, you know, what does school look like? What does, when we talk about college, what is it that we're talking about? What are the goals of the student in order to even think about fit? What are some of the fears or concerns that they have in order to really being able to address those, either to affirm some of those concerns or to help that the student even have that pivot within themselves. And so rather than, and I've done college access work and have had a lot of opportunities to maybe reframe conversations around college and what that looks like for students that might not have seen themselves in these spaces. And sometimes it's just kind of taking the time to figure out what is it that they think that they're going to see when they come to college, because a lot of times the language that we use whenever you're going to the next level of education, it's always like, oh, you can't do that here, or they're not going to accept that over there. You know, that type, it's very negative. But within the access programs that I've been able to be a part of, it's really focusing on, again, that asset-based piece, like let's build up the student and their familiarity with these spaces, being able to actually see themselves literally on campus, regardless of what type of campus it is, in order to break down the stigma of what, you know, this means to go to college. Students love the idea that you can make your own schedule and that you don't have to be there from, you know, 8 to 3:30 every single day, right? And that's often sometimes not a conversation, but that can be like the that starting point, to acknowledge that they have full lives and other things, and they don't love to go to school every day. And this is really for any student. Well, you know what? College is a place where that happens, right? And that's okay. And then you go and you, if you're able to, kind of take them to a local campus where they're able to actually engage and see what it's like. I didn't know what to expect when I went to college, but I was fortunate enough to be able to sit in on a math class, and math was not a top subject of mine. And I actually knew some of the stuff that they were talking about, and that made me feel more comfortable, like I could actually do it. Right. And so just being able to provide those opportunities at the forefront, rather than starting with, here's all the things that college is not, and here's how you need to change yourself to be there.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like we're out of time, so I think we're going to need to wrap up today. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Denicia. Thank you, Lauren, for your presentation. Just a reminder, we'll make this recording available on the NRC FAHE website, as well as the slides. And please be sure to join us for our next webinar in November. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.